This question may not get the time that it deserves, but it's a long one. It's from Anders Berg, who writes, sitting here watching Bellator 214 and listening to Goldie reminds me how good the UFC commentary has been since he left. One of the best
Wow.
One of the best parts of the UFC broadcast is the analyst's ability to break down the action and not just rattle off certain phrases at different moments of the fight. On the other hand, I also listened to Scott Coker do a media scrum earlier this week, and I thought to myself, man, he comes off like a damn professional. Compared to Dana White, he doesn't seem completely allergic to telling the truth and can actually build up all the fighters in his promotion. Dana has a hard time building up people that he didn't plan to, example, Henry Cejudo. My question is, what would the UFC look like if Scott Coker was in charge of the show? Seems to me like Scott Coker has the professionalism to take the UFC frontman position to the next level. In recent years, the UFC has brought in USADA, Reebok, WME, upgraded communicators or commentators, and ESPN, all in the name of furthering the sport. Is it time for the boss man to be upgraded? What would the UFC look like without Dana? So this is a couple of interesting points. Number one, UFC commentary is, in fact, quite good right now, if you ask me. They got a lot of talented people in the broadcast booth. But the more interesting question, the question that I think we want to sink our fangs into here, Ben, what would the UFC look like with social media assassin Scotty Cokes running it?
Now, see, this is a good question. Also, I agree, though, with the point, except I think you don't get better on commentary by losing Jimmy Smith, but I do feel the same thing about one of the things that bothers me about Mike Goldberg is when you listen to him and he just seems like a human speak and spell.
It's like somebody created a Mike Goldberg soundboard years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And there are just those moments where they're just like somebody's pushing buttons and like just phrases are going to come out and they're not necessarily tied to anything that's happening. But I was thinking about this similar question when watching Scott Coker in the post-fight press conference here. And I was at first having a little fun with it because he was talking about Ryan Bader, who's asked, where do you rank Ryan Bader pound for pound after this win? He was like, I think he's top 2 or 3. And you're like, well, come on. We're getting carried away. I understand everybody's excited. A lot of stuff just happened. But then you're like, okay, he is the promoter. We kind of forget that. Like when we get used to Dana White's style, his job is to try to put these guys over and try to get you excited about it and try to like build them up. We just kind of forget it because Dana White so often ends up doing the opposite. Or at least that's when he is at his most enthusiastic, it seems, is like when he is mad at somebody or yelling at somebody or trying to run somebody down. Like that's when he seems to be the most interested in what is going on. And so, yeah, it would be different. But also like Scott Coker, I guess the flip side of that coin is he doesn't have that same kind of like manic energy, or I don't even want to call it charisma, but something where the UFC is clearly built around Dana White from like a media presence standpoint, like always including him in commercials and things like for the ESPN stuff. He was like front row center of those commercials and really trying to build around his big personality. And Scott Coker is a little bit more of the quiet, keeping it reasonable type guy.
Yeah. I think Dana White, first of all, I think Dana White does a lot of stuff behind the scenes that we don't necessarily give him credit for in our day-to-day conversations about the sport. Just sort of like television production wise and in terms of logistics, I think he does a lot of things that don't necessarily make the headlines. He also clearly does a lot of things that do make headlines and not always for positive reasons. I think that he was the perfect guy for the UFC for a long time.
Yeah.
I think that the UFC, for much of its life under the Fertittas, needed a door-to-door knife salesman as the president, a guy who was going to come into your living room and tell you that he was going to show you the sharpest set of steak knives that you've ever seen, and then cut a tin can in half at your kitchen table.
And who could go on talk shows and argue with people about it and would enjoy that.
Right. Somebody that wasn't going to back down for any reason and was just going to kind of make the most of every spotlight opportunity. Is it different now? I think you could argue yes.
I think it's different now, and I think he's different now. I don't think he is as into this as he was.
We watch
more UFC fights than Dana White does.
That's probably true.
He doesn't even go to all these.
It would only be human, would it not, if after this many years on the job and some $150 million richer or whatever it is, now getting 9% of the UFC's annual profits or whatever, almost as much as all of the fighters put together. if Dana White didn't have the same gusto that he had at first. You could understand if he looked at it and was kind of like, look at where we started, look where we are now. I almost feel like my work here is done, but at the same time, I don't know what else to do with myself besides go to Maine and ride motorcycles 100 miles an hour.
Yeah. No, you do get that sense, and also the sense that because he will look at how successful they've been, it's impossible to convince him of a need for any course corrections, however small or big, because, hey, look, obviously I'm a goddamn genius. I got us here to this point, so everybody can shut up.
Would it be a positive or a negative, I wonder, if Scott Coker were to somehow take over the UFC at this point? Because I think it's clear that if Scott Coker were the president of the UFC from 2001 to 2008, the UFC may not have gotten as big as it did. I don't know that it's necessarily a perfect comparison to say, look at what happened to Strikeforce, but I don't know. Strikeforce was around about that time, and the UFC obviously ended up ingesting Strikeforce whole cloth pretty much at the end of its lifespan. But at this point, the UFC kind of is what it is, in my opinion. I don't necessarily know if you're going to get a ton more mainstream saturation than what you already have. Although this ESPN deal is probably the best chance that you have to increase your crossover appeal. If Scott Coker came over now, I can't really think of too many things that I feel like would clatter off the rails. Although maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not giving Dana White enough credit.
It's possible we wouldn't know it until we saw it. We wouldn't know what essential piece we were missing until...
I will say this. On the other hand, just considering the UFC's schedule right now, that would be a lot of Scott Coker. You would get a lot of exposure to Scott Coker, and perhaps over the course of 42 events in 2019, his more understated, occasionally let me go back and watch the fights before I give you a quote style might wear a little thin. I don't know.
Also, though, I'm saying if you're the UFC and you're thinking about replacing Dana White as president and you don't go hire Brian Stan, the fuck is wrong with you, man?